listening to Tea with Tolkien, a podcast for the Hobbit at heart. Join us as we chat about the works and faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to carry a little piece of Middle-earth into our own daily lives. Thanks for tuning in to part 19 of our Silmarillion read-along. We are on week 19 out of 20, so pretty much right at the end here now. Last week, we covered the first half of Akallabêth, so you'll want to listen to that episode before starting this one if you haven't already. This week, we are picking right back up where Ar-Pharazôn has become the 25th ruler of Númenor, and things are going downhill rather quickly. Now, our quote of the week is from this chapter. "And at last, Ar-Pharazôn came even to Aman, the Blessed Realm, and the coasts of Valinor, and still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For Ar-Pharazôn wavered at the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land as his own, if none should battle for it." So I think that quote sets the stage pretty nicely for what is about to happen at Númenor. So, picking back up where we left off last week, Ar-Pharazôn has just become king of Númenor, and he is desiring to become even more powerful and more glorious, seeking to be king even of men. Tolkien writes, "And he determined without counsel of the Valar, or the aid of any wisdom but his own, that the title of king of men he would himself claim, and he would compel Sauron to become his vassal and servant, for in his pride he deemed that no king should ever arise so mighty as to vie with the heir of Eärendil." Which is like crazy. Sauron, really? You think you're more powerful than Sauron? Okay. Meanwhile, Sauron, deeming himself unable and unready to fight against the Númenorians, didn't put up a fight when Ar-Pharazôn came and, wanted to tussle. Tolkien writes, "Therefore he humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn and smoothed his tongue, and men wondered, for all he said seemed fair and wise. After this, Sauron was brought as a prisoner to Númenor," which is like exactly what Sauron wanted, so this is working out great. Within just 3 years, Sauron went from a prisoner to becoming close within the council of the king. Tolkien writes, "For flattery sweet as honey was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things yet unrevealed to men." So Sauron's at it again. Sauron convinced the Númenorians to worship the darkness. He said, "And out of it the world was made, for darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord thereof may yet make other worlds to be gifts to those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end." And after this, Sauron then convinced the king that Melkor was indeed the Lord of Darkness. After this, Tolkien writes, "Then Ar-Pharazôn the king turned back to the worship of the dark, and of Melkor the Lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly and in the face of his people, and they for the most part followed him." Under Sauron's counsel, the people of Númenor were forbidden to visit the Temple of Eru, and Sauron also urged the king to cut down the White Tree. So, all in all, this is not good, but Sauron is getting exactly what he wanted because this king is pretty stupid. The chief of the faithful, who were then called rebels at the time, was Amandiel. His son was named Elendil, and his sons were Isildur and Anarion. They led the remainder of the faithful to Ravenna, for they were in danger, and everyone was kind of just trying to get out of there. Now, fearing that the White Tree would be cut down, Isildur snuck in and did this little covert operation, basically, and he took a fruit from the tree, and he planted it in secret. Shortly after this, the tree was indeed cut down, so he came just in the nick of time. Sauron then instructed the king to build a temple to Melkor in Armenelos. In this temple, there was a great altar of fire, on which Sauron burnt the wood of Nimloth, the White Tree. After this, the Númenorians also offered human sacrifice to Melkor, quote, "that he should release them from death." Tolkien writes, "And most often among the faithful they chose their victims, yet never openly on the charge that they would not worship Melkor, the giver of freedom. Rather was cause sought against them that they hated the king and were his rebels, or that they plotted against their kin, devising lies and poisons. However, rather than save them from death, the sacrifice hastened death and brought about death more abundantly, and a madness and sickness assailed Númenor and kind of spread, so everyone is everything is just getting worse and worse as this goes on. However, despite a general sense of unhappiness, Tolkien writes that it seemed to the Númenóreans that they prospered, and if they were not increased in happiness, yet they grew more strong, and their rich men even richer. The lords of Númenor hunted the men of Middle-earth, enslaving them and sacrificing many of them on their altars. So this is a huge jump from the beginning of Númenor, as they came as teachers and bringers of gifts and knowledge. Suddenly now, I mean, not suddenly because it's been thousands of years, but at this point, they've come as basically like slave traders and murderers. It's insane. Now, so all of this is going on, and it's just getting worse and worse. And when Ar-Pharazôn had grown old and was coming close to his death, Sauron knew that his time had come to finally unveil his plan. Sauron spoke to him and convinced him to make war with the Valar and to claim the Blessed Realm for himself. Amandil, knowing that the end of Númenor was come near, told his son Elendil that he planned to sail to the Blessed Realm and plead before the Valar just like Eärendil had done. He urged Elendil to gather the faithful and flee to Ravenna, so they all worked on that, and Amandil sailed into the west and was not seen again. Tolkien writes, "Men could not a second time be saved by any such embassy, and for the treason of Númenor there was no easy absolving." So, even though this worked for Eärendil, it did not work for Amandil. He was unsuccessful, unfortunately. Then Elendil and his sons prepared their ships to depart, and they brought with them the 7 stones, which are the Palantiri, and the young tree, which was the descendant of Nimloth. There's a really interesting quote in this section where Amandil is talking to Elendil, and he says, "For there is but one loyalty from which no man can be absolved in heart for any cause." And I thought that was an excellent quote to just pull out and dwell on for a minute. Now, while the weather had previously been mild for Númenor, the skies became darkened in this time, and there were great storms with clouds shaped as eagles bringing lightning. The men called them the Eagles of Manwë, and while some were pretty scared of these and repented, most of them hardened their hearts against the Valar and felt as if the Valar were attacking them. Sauron was unharmed by this lightning, and the Númenóreans took that as a sign that he was a god. So, once again, Sauron is using everything to his advantage. As this was going on, the king started to prepare the fleets of Númenor, and they readied themselves for battle against the Valar. And as this was happening, Sauron withdrew into the temple, where he continued to make human sacrifices to Melkor. Ar-Pharazôn then led the fleets of the Númenóreans towards Aman. And this is where we get our quote of the week. So Ar-Pharazôn comes all the way to Aman, all the way to the Blessed Realm, to the coasts of Valinor, and he steps foot on the shores of Valinor. The Valar relinquished their dominion of Arda for a time, and Ilúvatar acted. So when Ilúvatar himself needs to step in, you know you're in trouble. Tolkien writes, "But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world, and a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the Deathless Lands. And the waters flowed into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken. All the fleets of Númenor were swallowed up into the abyss, and all who had set foot upon the shores of Aman were buried under falling hills. There they lied imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten until the last battle in the day of doom." Thus the Blessed Realm and Eressëa were removed completely, and Númenor was swallowed into the sea. Tolkien writes, "And there is not now upon earth any place abiding where the memory of a time without evil is preserved." Now Elendil and his sons and those who had gotten on their ships with them were saved, and they came to Middle-earth. But Sauron fell as he was in the temple, and he laughed even as he fell into the abyss. Now he was not mortal, so he couldn't die, and his spirit remained and fled back to Middle-earth. However, his bodied form that he had taken up was destroyed, and so he just came back as a spirit. And he came back to Middle-earth and was taking up his great ring, and we'll read about what happens next week. It is said that the summit of the Meneltarma, the Pillar of Heaven, remained as an island. And after the downfall of Númenor, the world was made round, whereas it had been flat, which is crazy. So quite a lot changes, and the world will never be the same after Akallabêth. We will be back next week for our final part 20 of our Silmarillion read-along series, in which we'll go through the final part of the Silmarillion, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I love to hear from you. You can reach me on Twitter or Instagram at teawithtolkien, or by using the contact form on my website, teawithtolkien.com. And we don't really do sponsors for this podcast, but if you're interested in supporting Tea with Tolkien, you can check out the Tea with Tolkien shop. It's at teawithtolkien.com/shop, or you can consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/teawithtolkien. Thank you so much, and I will be back next week.